Resident Evil 3's Remake was one of my more anticipated games heading into 2020. Not only was its reveal a complete shock coming less than a year after RE2, it was interesting to think about how the developers would handle RE3, since both projects started development at around the same time. I was pretty excited after trying out the demo that came out before launch, but I kind of lost interest in the game when I saw the reviews that came out. Gaming sites gave out scores similar to what the original RE3 got back in the day, but reception from players seemed all over the place. The remake did have its defenders, but the overwhelming majority on YouTube seemed to write the game off as a disappointment, or even bad depending on who you looked to. That kind of turned me off of playing the remake until recently, when I bought a Steam key for almost half its retail price tag. After going in with low expectations, I ended up being pleasantly surprised when I walked away from the remake with nearly 4 consecutive playthroughs back to back, to where I feel like RE3 deserves another look. With prices only dropping from here on out and with new RE games on the horizon, it felt like a good time as any to reevaluate RE3's remake and see how it really is. Of course, before we go any further, it's worth pointing out that this really isn't a proper remake so much as it feels more like a reinterpretation of the original game. For a good idea of what to expect, think back to RE2's remake but doubling down on the creative liberties taken. The characters and plot beats are mostly the same between games, but the source material has been overhauled to where it expands or cuts out elements from the original game, both from a narrative and a gameplay aspect. I feel like this is worth pointing out since it seems like some people went into this game expecting it to be like the original RE3, and it's really not. They both feel similar in spirit, taking the formula from the originals and putting in more emphasis on the action, but while one plays like a standard PS1 horror title, the other one goes for a more linear cinematic approach. I didn't mind the change, but I could get why people were upset if they went into this expecting it to be more in line with the other remakes. A good way to show what I mean is by comparing the starts for both games. In the original RE3, you watch Raccoon City completely fall to the undead by a cutscene, and after escaping Jill's apartment, it's not long until you're set loose to explore the mostly desolate streets of Raccoon City. You'll have to explore, track down Brad, and solve some puzzles in order to progress the story. In the remake though, things unfold a bit differently. You start out in Jill's apartment, but this time you're able to look around and read up on some notes that fill in the gaps between Resi's 1 and 3, before Nemesis pays her a surprise visit this time. She'll meet up with Brad, same as always, but now he's killed by some zombies at the bar instead of getting finished off by Nemesis at the police station. Here, things feel noticeably more linear and scripted, and it's not until you arrive at downtown Raccoon City that you'll be able to freely explore the environments at your own pace. There's tons more examples of this happening throughout the remake, with characters' fates and events changing just enough to feel fresh to veterans of the original. Jill's failed escape from Raccoon City, for instance, happens early on compared to the original game where it took place at the clock tower, and Nemesis undergoes some new transformations which make for some more interesting boss fights. There's of course plenty of moments that are meant to remind you of the original game, but these mostly serve as references in terms of landmarks or the odd puzzle or two. Beyond that, it's mostly new content throughout your entire playthrough. I say mostly because while R3 offers new locations and gameplay features, it does reuse a ton of aspects from its predecessor. The originals were like this too, and it certainly makes for an interesting contrast, going from the more survival horror heavy approach of RE2 to the more action-packed vibes of RE3. But this definitely feels like it was more of a lower priority title for Capcom with how much of the remake was outsourced, and it was likely due to borrowing heavily from RE2 in terms of assets and tech that was able to be released so quickly. Nothing wrong with that though, since RE2 had a great foundation to use, and the changes made here definitely make for a fun action game. In RE2, resources felt a bit more scarce, and it was definitely more reliant on item management, but with a greater focus on combat you're now given a lot more to work with in terms of ammo and healing items. The ability to dodge returns from the original RE3, and it replaces RE2's use of sub-weapons to counterattack. It was kind of tricky back then to pull off, and it wouldn't always save you during the Nemesis fights, but now it's far easier to use with just a simple button press, and nailing a perfect dodge will slow down time and lock onto an enemy's weak point. It makes avoiding enemies pretty easy, but it really does come in handy during boss fights on the game's higher difficulty settings. These may seem like small changes in the grand scheme of things, but I personally found myself enjoying combat a lot more thanks to them. Even when fighting mostly the same enemy types from RE2, there was just something really satisfying about how it all felt. It especially was the case during my encounters with Nemesis. Most of his fights just sort of blended together for me in the original game, but he has some really great standout encounters here. Each fight just sort of feels like a spectacle, especially thanks to the game's incredible visuals and how great it runs even on consoles. The way the camera moves around during some of the game's cutscenes too is also really well done, resulting in moments that are more interesting to watch compared to what you got in RE2. The main thing disappointing about Nemesis is that he doesn't appear much during the game's free roaming segments, and generally just sort of appears far less, with the focus being more on Jill's last escape from Raccoon City. In the original game, he felt like a constant threat and was really tough to put down, but here things are a bit too easy. He felt more aggressive than someone like Mr. X, who is far too easy to outrun, but in comparison he just goes down far too easily with a well-thrown grenade near an electrical box. That's not to say he's neutered entirely. His boss fights on Nightmare mode can be quite the challenge, and the developers clearly love the creature as shown during the game's more cinematic moments. I just wish that there could have been a few more tweaks done. Puzzles are mostly all but removed in this remake, though personally I didn't mind that. There was plenty of backtracking in RE2, but it worked thanks to that game's smaller sense of scale, and it was interesting seeing how most of the areas in that game connected to one another. RE3 on the other hand is more action focused even compared to the original game, and throughout its short length it always pushes the player down new paths, as you'll rarely stay in the same place for long. This is admittedly one problem I have with the game. I love how varied the environments are, even when it reuses some from RE2. I really do love Raccoon City as a setting, especially seeing it completely wrecked but still shining bright with neon lights. But I really hope that some areas could have been fleshed out more, or some areas like downtown were a bit larger to explore, as areas like the clock tower interiors and the park are removed in the remake. The absence of some areas isn't necessarily the biggest loss in the world. The time you spent in the park in the original RE3 really wasn't that much either. But seeing outside of some of the levels, especially outside the hospital stores, it really does make me wonder what could have been. That feeling of what could have been does apply to other parts of the game, like some aspects of the story. I'm not saying it's bad by any means. In fact, I love seeing things unfold, and it's backed by some really likable characters and good performances. My problem with it though is that since it's short like the original RE3, it doesn't feel like it's really able to explore some new concepts within its short time frame, like Jill's PTSD for example. The opening plays around with the angle that Jill is having nightmares after the Spencer Mansion incident, and she's fearful that she's probably going through a slow infection. According to some notes in her apartment, she's also paranoid that she's being watched at all times, but outside of one segment near the end of the game, these ideas really aren't explored that much. It almost feels like there's another 15 minutes of plot that just couldn't make its way into the final game. And since some areas like the clock tower and the park were cut, I thought it would have been cool to have replaced them with some new areas. But these are admittedly small gripes I have with an otherwise great story, and like plenty of other survival horror games, Resident Evil 3's remake is short by nature. But while I really enjoyed my time with it, I often found myself wishing that it could have been a bit longer. While it does have some features cut from the original RE3 like the live selections and Operation Mad Jackal, there's still plenty of reasons to come back and replay it. Once you complete the game, you unlock the endgame item shop, where you could spend credits on new things like weapons and perks meant to help you out in the main game. It definitely took after Mad Jackal in this regard, and in some cases there's even more stuff to work towards, as to unlock credits you'll need to complete certain challenges in the game. Some of these challenges include completing the game in under 2 hours, getting an S rank on certain difficulty settings, or killing a certain amount of enemies, and these also unlock character models and concept art. Playing the game on higher difficulties like Nightmare mode also changes things up. Not only do you take less damage, but enemy and item spawns have been changed across the board, and there's even been some additional events like having a zombie Brad wandering throughout the Raccoon City Police Department. I still wish there could have been some things implemented from the original though, like dynamic events, or even some form of RNG as a difficulty modifier. During the hospital level in the original game, I noticed that some things like enemy spawns and certain puzzle codes felt extremely different, not on multiple playthroughs but just by reloading my save file at various points, which really did add some replay value to it. As it stands, RE3 still has good replay value for being a short but well-polished experience that rewards players for coming back, but a bit more could have been done to make it even better. Especially in terms of unlockable outfits, console users are a bit out of luck with how few there are, but thankfully there's plenty of options on the PC thanks to mods. It's also worth talking about Resistance, the standalone multiplayer mode added on in place of Operation Mad Jackal. It's a 4v1 game type where you play as a group of survivors trying to escape against a mastermind out to eliminate them. I haven't played much of it, only 2 to 3 hours, so take it for what it is when I say, I kinda liked it. I haven't played any multiplayer horror games before this, and my only experience so far in multiplayer was some couch co-op of Part 5 on the PS3, so this is kind of new territory for me. I also want to stress that I'm terrible at this game mode. The game has a practice option which lets you explore the maps, but it and RE3 really don't do the best job of preparing you for what's to come online. And by that, I mean how things can go from good to bad in a moment's notice. I definitely had fun playing as a survivor and just barely making it, even when I got caught off guard and the whole team got wiped. And RE's gameplay definitely translates well into a multiplayer setting, with survivors splitting up and completing objectives within a time limit. I've only played as a mastermind once, but I still like the idea of setting up traps and enemies to slow down the survivors, even if I'm terrible at both roles in general. Sorry for anyone that had to play with me. I could see why Capcom would package this with RE3, since the base game by itself really doesn't have as much content as its predecessor. And Capcom themselves admitted as such in interviews, where Resistance was planned to be the main hook that kept people coming back to this game. On paper it makes sense, something like RE's Battle Mode or Mad Jackal but with 5-player online support, it definitely had the potential for endless replay value. And it's not like there was a lack of effort on Neobart's part, since in terms of support, there's plenty of updates and the like. Unfortunately, the game's player base is fairly small on PC, not quite dead, but it will take some time to get a match going compared to consoles I assume. I could see this game potentially getting a second wind if it were to relaunch on PS5 or Xbox Series X as a free-to-play title, with rewards for those that purchased RE3 at launch. As it is now though, I don't see this game type potentially lasting that much longer, and with the need for additional players compared to Mad Jackal or Raid mode, Resistance has a chance of going down in the history books as just this weird novelty. Looking back on RE3's remake, I'm still not entirely sure what to make of it, as I simultaneously like it both more and less in some ways than the original game. I certainly don't view this as a replacement for the original game, by any means, but as someone that's played through both titles, I still find myself happy with treating this as a fun little reimagining of the original game. It certainly feels like a missed opportunity at points, and like the original, Capcom just sort of rushed this together for one last current gen release to hold fans over, before they release the newest game on next gen platforms. It definitely could have been better, but for what it is, it's still a really well polished action game that I could see myself coming back to, especially during the Halloween season for one quick game to marathon. Altogether, I got 24 hours in this game alone, and I definitely feel like it's worth it when it goes on sale for $30 or less. Definitely a tough title to recommend for people that only play through games once, but for those that don't, I think they'll have a fun time with it. It definitely doesn't deserve the amount of flack it got at launch, but if RE7 and RE2 were great titles, Resident Evil 3's remake is just sort of a good Resident Evil. It's certainly a rough start for M2, but according to Game News, things can only get better from here on out, and I'll definitely be there to give them a second chance on future projects. But that's all I have to say for now, so thanks for watching.